I want to talk to you all today about neutral spine. So this particular spine, if you're laying on your back, okay, the natural curves of the spine, and this is not talking about scoliosis curves, this is about neutral spine curves. They say we have 4 natural curves. So if you're laying on your back, the back of the pelvis is touching the floor, and there's this triangular bone at the base of the spine called the sacrum. That curve moves towards the floor. Okay, if you move up a little bit higher, the lumbar, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae, that curve, you can see I can fit my hand underneath that a little bit. That natural curve is called a lordosis. It moves away from the floor if you're laying on your back. The next 12 vertebrae are your thoracic vertebrae, and those move in a kyphosis, where the curve moves towards the floor if you're laying on your back. And then the cervical, you have 7 cervical vertebrae, that curve moves away from the floor. And that's also a lordosis. So the lumbar lordosis and the cervical lordosis mirror each other. And the sacral kyphosis and thoracic kyphosis mirror each other. Why is that important? Well, in back care and yoga for back care and scoliosis work, a lot of the things that we do are neutral spine, particularly because if you have a back condition, let's say like herniation or scoliosis or other types of back conditions, and you're constantly rounding your low back or pulling it into your curves when you bend over, for example, that can aggravate a lot of back conditions. It can cause pain, discomfort, pinchiness, tingling, shooting pains, things like that. Each person is very individual, so when I work with people individually, we address their specific needs, but this is one of the general rules. Sometimes I will break the rule, but not rounding the lumbar is one of the ones in back care classes that I pretty much stick with for the most part. In my flow classes and my ropes classes, we round the back all the time, but it's a different type of yoga. Very, very different than the specialized type of yoga for back care and scoliosis work. So if you don't have blocks, you can do this without blocks. If you have 2 yoga blocks, we'll integrate this idea of neutral spine into one of the poses or 2 of the poses. So in mountain pose, you take the block between your inner thighs. This is mountain pose with block 1, 2, and 3. And we'll call this block 1. If you don't have a block, just imagine that you have it there. And instead of having your feet far apart, try having them closer together. Some of you might even have your feet touch. But don't lock your knees. If you lock your knees, you disconnect from your legs. One of the principles in back care is connecting the legs to the spine. And it's okay if it doesn't click right away. It's like learning a new language. With repetition, eventually you're going to have all these aha moments. So just see it as a process and be curious. Toes lift, bend your knees a little, and just imagine connecting your ankles to your knees and your knees to your hip sockets. We call that a pathway through the joints. Now imagine your femur bone, your thigh bone, plugging into the hip socket on a diagonal, like a plug in an outlet. And you can see already I'm starting to get length in my lumbar. And I can touch, and you can do this with me, touch your low back and make a space above and below where you're touching, and lift your back bottom ribs. Now block 2, lift your chest into block 2. If you don't have a block, put your hands on your chest and lift into your hands. Keep softening the knees so you're not locking. And squeeze block 1 up, connect your legs to your hip sockets. Lift block 2 up, lift your back bottom ribs. Bring your hands or your block to your crown, elbows not wide, forward and narrow. Resist your head up into block 3 or into your hands. So I'm giving my spine feedback. My hands are actively pressing down, my head is actively pressing up. And I'm not pushing my head forward. I'm keeping my ears back and the back of the skull in line with the back of the pelvis. 2 more breaths. Try to breathe through your nose. If you don't push your hips forward, you can place your toes back down. If your hips moved, keep your toes up, bend your knees a little. Let your next exhale be long through the nose. Inhale long through the nose. And then release. And when you bend over, instead of rounding your back to put things down, bend your knees and have your feet really wide. And we call this a sumo squat. You're going to stick your butt out and bend over like that, so that when you're picking things up, instead of doing this, you're keeping your neutral spine. Now we're coming into what's called LPose. I highly recommend that you look into a mirror to see yourself from the side, or if you don't have access to that, videotape yourself with your phone and look and see if what you're doing is what you think you're doing. A lot of times people will not be neutral but think they are, and it's very common to be able to notice when that's happening and then be able to redirect. So I'm taking my hands a little higher than my hips, and then hands on the wall. Remember block 1, 2, and 3. Very common to push the head forward. Keep your head up. Then bend your knees and let your sit bones lead the way. So I'm not changing my spine. It's called pelvic flexion. I'm flexing at the hip crease. Then the sit bones reach back as the crown reaches forward, kind of like you're pulling a slinky in 2 directions or a curly hair in 2 directions. Then imagine connecting your ankles to your knees, knees to hip sockets. Make a space in your low back. Press your shoulder socket onto your arm bone. Watch my shoulders. Shoulder socket onto arm bone. And try not to sink your head. Keep your ears higher than your arms or between your arms. And if you have the advantage of seeing yourself in a mirror, you can see if your spine is neutral. So if you look closely at my low back, you can see my lumbar lordosis. If I flatten it out or round it, then I'm not neutral anymore. Now with scoliosis, there's a slight variation because one side is more convex and one side is more concave, so you want to make allowance for that. But I'm really trying to create space in my spine. So what we're doing is strengthening around a new pattern so that essentially if I have places where I compress or I sink into my curves, or if you have other types of back conditions where you feel like there are places that feel crunchy or a nerve's getting impinged, we're starting to create space for a new pattern that comes through repetition. And small actions are really powerful. And what I will say also is, for those of us with scoliosis, it's a common thing in the medical community to call the convex side a hump. I highly recommend that you call it your curved side or your convex side, particularly because the way we speak to our bodies makes a difference in the way that we practice, in the way that we heal, in the way that we see ourselves, in the way that we see the world. So try it, let me know how it goes, and I look forward to hearing from you.